Hello, everyone. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Benjamin Nymark. I am going to moderate this panel. Very happy to do so. It's my privilege. The COP27 virtual panel, Military Missions Gap, our annual update 2022. As mentioned, I am a senior lecturer at the School of Business Management and fellow at Queen Mary University of London. I am also the PI of Principal Investigator of Concrete Impacts, a UKRI ESRC funded project examining the socio-ecological effects of military supply chains. Again, let me just say that this is an absolute privilege to host this important session. Let me also say we've come a long way in 1 year since COP26 in Glasgow. Although the antecedents of military missions reporting did not start last year, as Doug and Lindsay, speakers on this panel, and Stuart Parkinson will sort of attest to. People have been working on this project for some time. Anita Crawford, Nick Buxton, Axel, and others have been putting some significant time in sort of calling out the military and reporting on military missions. However, our entry point and really our point of departure last year, we launched the Military Missions Gap at COP26 in Glasgow. Our really sort of take-home message from that launch was that militaries are huge energy users whose greenhouse gas emissions are making a significant contribution to the climate crisis. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change clearly obliges some states to report their greenhouse emissions every year. But because reporting of military emissions is voluntary, data is often absent or incomplete. Military reporting needs to be on the table at the UNFCCC. In a sense, this is the military emissions gap. However, I would argue, after speaking to the panel, of course, that and Stuart Parkinson clearly reminded me that our big message has really changed a bit. Yes, we cannot cut what we don't know. And right now, governments don't report their military's emissions, so we know very little. However, there are things we do know. And one thing we do know is that militaries need to begin cuts now. This is what we've stressed in our recent Nature article, spearheaded by Mohammed Rajifar. And co-authors, many on the panel today. What we've done here is put together a sort of eclectic mix of academics, civil society groups, advocacy members, which I argue is probably one of the reasons why we've been so successful in keeping the pressure on. We want to continue that pressure. Clearly, we've been quite good at sort of making our mark within the media and the pressure within sort of different press outlets. However, we need to push more into the policy realm. Before we move on, I'd like to just note a few housekeeping rules here for our panel. People could drop questions as we move along on the chat, but we're going to hold all questions till the end, where we'll have a fuller conversation. Our Q&A is going to be hosted by Ellie, our second moderator here for this panel. The panel consists of Lizzie Cautel of the Conflict and Environment Observatory, who's be speaking on what militaries report to the UNFCCC in 2020. Doug Weir will be speaking about tracking military greenhouse gas emissions in war and peace. Dr. Stuart Parkinson, scientist for global responsibility, will be speaking about estimating global military missions. And our last speaker, Inshu Wang, we're really excited to have from Green Korea United, who will be speaking about holding governments accountable. Our first speaker, Lindsay Cautel from the Conflict Environment Observatory, who she's been working with since 2019. She is a chartered environmentalist and worked with environmental consultancy for the sector for the past 25 years. She's the Environmental Policy Officer at CEOBS. Lindsay's been examining data on fuel use submitted to the UNFCCC and will be presenting an overview on the trends and data sets and what needs to change, basically a how-to guide to reporting. So I'd like to pass it over to Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Ben. I will just share my screen. Can everyone see that?
All good.
Great. Okay, thanks, Ben, for the introductions, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. As Ben said, I want to give a quick update of the data which is submitted to the UN for military fuel use and explain some of the issues which we have found. And a quick reminder why I focus on the military. As Ben said, firstly, they are huge consumers of fossil fuel. Secondly, we know relatively little about their overall impact on global greenhouse gas emissions. And thirdly, we know this needs to change. So, as Ben said, last year we set up the Military Emissions Gap website because we realised in the run-up to COP26 how extremely difficult it was to find and examine data submitted to the UN on military fuel use. Also, no one else seemed to be tracking military greenhouse gas data collectively, and we wanted to get a better understanding of what was being submitted by states, and we wanted to see what it was telling us and what else was needed. So, as I mentioned, data submitted to the UN on military fuel use is pretty difficult to find. The data sits under energy, under category 1A5, other, not specified elsewhere. And this includes statutory fuel use, so that's kind of like heating and bases or generators, and mobile fuel use, so vehicles, ships, aviation. And because of the other, this means that the data can also include sometimes other civilian sources. So it's quite difficult to see what is actually sometimes military data or not. Military fuel use data can also be reported elsewhere. Sometimes it might be aggregated and found under transport, for example, or other sectors. And we often don't know what's happening with respect to military bunker fuels, for example. So a bit of a spoiler alert here, I'm afraid. Since looking at the data last year and looking at it this year, I'm afraid we've seen no improvements. We looked at Annex 1 countries, so they're classified as industrialised. They've got a collective military spend in 2021 of $1.34 trillion US, and this is higher than it was in 2020, where it sat at $1.27 trillion. So we also looked at non-annex countries, if they fall in the top 60 with respect to military spending in the world. And we looked at the data that was being submitted to the UN, and we gave it a commentary on its transparency. So is this data, how easy it is to find? Is it aggregated with other civilian data sets? And what is the gap in emissions reporting? So this is looking at a kind of qualitative scoring, which is based on the methodology which Stuart is going to explain later on in this webinar. But remember that we're only seeing here military fuel use data. So it does have it does fall short in terms of gauging what the overall military carbon footprint is. We've also on the website included a link to the current UNFCCC reports submitted by states, and some states do provide in-country reporting. So, for example, through the Department of Defence, Ministry of Defence's annual reports. So where we found this, we've included a link, and we hope to look and develop this in the future and add more commentary on the in-country reporting itself. So, looking at the Annex 1 countries, so the industrialised countries, as I said, it's pretty much the same as last year. We're seeing very few report both their stationary and their mobile military fuel use. There's just 5, those ones shown here in green. Several report no mobile fuel data or no data at all. These are the ones that are shown in red. And this includes Russia, France, Japan, Turkey, Poland, which collectively they make up a military expenditure of about $200 billion US. Most of them that you see here only just report the mobile military fuel use data. So as for last year, again, we're seeing many inconsistencies. There's also a few odd surprises as well. For example, there's countries that last year did report mobile data, like Sweden, and this year they're not reporting any. And this is in spite the Swedish Ministry of Defence actually providing annual sustainability reports. There's other surprises as well and inconsistencies. New Zealand, for example, I know they're only relatively small, they're 52nd with respect to ranking in military expenditure. There's no UNFCCC data for New Zealand, but they do report it on a country level. So we're not certain why there are these inconsistencies, but they're there, and it means we've got these many gaps. So with such poor data sets, it's really, really tricky to kind of show any overall trends. But just looking at some of the mobile fuel use data for a selection of Annex 1 countries, you can see that between 2019 and 2020, we do see some increases and we see some decreases across countries. And with COVID-19, we may have expected perhaps all-round reductions in mobile fuel use, but this isn't necessarily the case. So looking at, we looked at 32 non-Annex 1 countries, and 15 of these fall within the top 30 with respect to military expenditure. And again, typically, we're not seeing any useful data sets. There's some exceptions like Chile and Malaysia, odd ones as well, like Peru. Last year, they reported military aviation fuel in their national inventory report. This year, they're not providing it, we can't find it. And this is despite, again, there's military spend increases. So this was $500 billion US in 2020. And in 2021, this increased to $555 billion US. So there's no useful data on military emissions despite this huge expenditure. What I would like to say is that things can be done better. If you were able to listen to the COP27 side event from the Ukrainian pavilion yesterday, the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine have carried out initial assessments of the greenhouse gas emissions from Russia's war. This covers a 7-month period. So it shows what can be done. In terms of country reporting, this will differ from what's reported to the UN because as I've explained before, we're only seeing military fuel use data. Countries do estimate and report, some countries do estimate and report greenhouse gas emissions, but typically this just covers energy use at military bases and fuel use from the operation of military equipment only. It's encouraging that we're seeing countries reporting their greenhouse gas emissions, but the scopes really do vary. And there are some improvements. So, for example, the UK Ministry of Defence reporting, which was published for this year, does now include some scope 3 emissions in part. So that is covering business travel, commuting, waste, service, family accommodation, energy. And as you can see from the difference reported on the right in 2022 compared to that reported on the left for the previous year, there's a big difference. And then I mentioned New Zealand. So New Zealand, again, as I said, it's only got a small expenditure ranking in terms of global, it's 52nd. But as I mentioned, they are reporting greenhouse gas data. And this is also independently verified against the international standard on greenhouse gas accounting. They've also set mandated targets for reductions. This is a target to reduce by 42% by 2029-2030 compared to 2018-2019. And the ministry, New Zealand ministry, don't yet report emissions generated through procurement, but it does state that they are looking at capability to develop this, and then they will start tracking it. So in summary, reporting to the UN, I'm afraid, remains poor. We know that improvements are possible, and we know that they're necessary. We have big military spenders submitting no useful data at all. So the current UNFCCC reporting requires only provision of military fuel use data. And this, of course, does not account for all military greenhouse gas emissions. And this means we've got huge gaps, and this needs to improve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindsay, very much. I really appreciate it. Awesome. That was a great summary of the work that we've been doing on the military emissions gap, particularly you guys at the Conflict Environment Observatory. It makes perfect sense that I would then like to introduce Doug Weir, who's the Research and Policy Director at the Conflict and and Environment Observatory. It's taking research and advocacy on polluting legacy of armed conflict and military activities since 2005, and founded CEOBS in 2017. He's currently focusing on the development of the legal framework, protecting the environment in relation to armed conflict. So let me welcome Doug, who is up and ready to go.
Great, thank you, Ben, and thank you to all our attendees today. Carrying on from Lindsay's presentation, I'd just like to speak briefly about a study we published earlier this year. Its aim was to explore which emissions sources militaries and others should be reporting on. So we've heard about fuel use essentially thus far. So we'll post a link to the full report in the chat, but I'd just like to flag a few key findings quickly. So the first thing to understand is what the military emissions gap looks like right now. We've kind of had the reporting gap from Lindsay, but if we were going to imagine what this gap looks like and where the data is missing, it would look a little bit like this. So you might be familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol, and this is used across many sectors to report emissions. It divides the sources of these emissions into 3 scopes. Scope 1 are direct emissions, like the fuel that your vehicles burn. Scope 2 covers the energy that you buy in, so the emissions that come out of the power plant that then get sent to your home. Scope 3 are the emissions created by the stuff that you buy, so all the way along the supply chain. As you can see here, most of the limited data that we have, which is reported nationally or to the UNFCCC, is Scope 1, fuel. So no militaries have a complete picture of their Scope 3 supply chain emissions. Some are moving towards that, as we've just heard from Lindsay, but overall, that's a big gap at the moment. So the 3 scopes of the greenhouse gas protocol are intended to be a generic model for civilian businesses, organizations, and entities. But the more we thought about it, the more important it seemed to be able to capture the emissions generated by conflicts somehow. And so we introduced what we call Scope 3+. But figuring out what you should be reporting on is just part of the process, right? It's also critical that you understand why you're doing it, and while you're doing it, reflect best practice. Given the history of military emissions reporting and its current state, which we've heard about from Lindsay, transparency is a really critical issue here. Militaries are massive fossil fuel consumers, and they face some huge technological hurdles if they're to reduce their emissions. Many are already under pressure to do so, and some are making very bold claims around targets and net zero goals. In some cases, they're so keen to paint a positive picture to internal and external audiences that they aren't being entirely open about how serious some of the technological challenges are that they face. The transition away from fossil-based fuels to synthetic fuels in aviation is a really good example of this. We're in a climate crisis, so it's right to be bold, but we already have major issues with trust. Transparency and honesty can help to reduce that problem, but without trust, there will be legitimate allegations of military-grade greenwashing. And so it's for this reason that we were so concerned about NATO's refusal to make the emissions tracking methodology it's developed for its members public. This is supposed to be rolled out to its member nations who wanted to use it. It sets a really dangerous precedent globally, we think, because this issue is much bigger than NATO militaries alone. I think, as Lindsay's pointed out, these top 60 military spenders come from all over the world. It's not just an issue for NATO militaries. We need to have a level playing field in terms of military emissions reporting and best practice. Okay, so it's also really important to focus on measuring the right things. As Lindsay said, most of the talk right now is around fuel use and the emissions that it creates, Scope 1. And where states have data, this is what it tends to cover. So, for example, here in the UK, when the Ministry of Defence acknowledges that it's responsible for more than 50% of the government's total emissions, it's mainly fuel use that they're talking about. And a large part of that is aviation fuel from the Royal Air Force. But that isn't Scope 3. It isn't the supply chain emissions. Comparative studies of different sectors show that supply chain emissions can be 5 to 11 times that of the organisation's Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So here in the UK, that means there are estimates that the Ministry of Defence may be responsible for 5% of the UK's total emissions. So if you take the whole Scope 3 into account, that's a major chunk of the UK's annual carbon budget. And so onto our framework for what we think militaries should be reporting on. Now, there's nothing particularly revolutionary in Scopes 1 to 3. Where this differs is in our Scope 3+. We view Scope 3+, wartime emissions, as a climate cost of militaries doing business, and something that they and other stakeholders need to get a handle on. And there is a direction of travel here. Policymakers need to weigh up the costs of war, and they do this in different ways: the political, the economic, the humanitarian to some extent, and increasingly the environmental costs, broadly speaking. But we also need to understand the climatic costs of conflict and militarism more generally. And right now we have a very poor handle on this. It's not just about being able to say that a particular conflict generated X amount of emissions. If we understand the processes that generate emissions during and after conflicts, we're much better placed to design interventions to minimize them. This could include how and where wars are fought, but it could also include tailored policies that help to support conflict-affected states towards low carbon transitions during post-conflict recovery. The debate around military and conflict emissions is developing really quickly. And I think our challenge right now is to make sure that we're talking and thinking about the right things. And this was partly why we developed the framework. So I'll just leave a few key messages. Transparency is a really vital component of greenhouse gas reporting. It's also something which militaries find quite difficult at times. We also need to be counting the right things. It's not just about fuel, it's about stuff as well as fuel. And then finally, wartime emissions monitoring is in its infancy, but it's vital for understanding the climatic costs of war. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. The link to the report is up on our website. If you just search on our website for framework, it will pop up. So thanks a lot, and back to you, Ben.
Great, thank you very much. Doug Weir from CEOBS. Following up very nicely from Lindsay, also from CEOBS. It's my pleasure also to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Stuart Parkinson has been working on these issues for quite some time, from the Scientists for Global Responsibility. Stuart is Executive Director of the Scientists for Global Responsibility. He's held that post for roughly 20 years. He's an expert and lead author of multiple reports on military carbon emissions. He's an expert reviewer also for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Today, Stuart will summarize his latest research estimating the global military carbon footprint using a new methodology that he's developed alongside colleagues. So I'll gladly hand it over to you, Stuart.
Many thanks, Ben, and to all of you for coming, and to all the people behind the scenes who are helping make this happen. So I shall share a few slides, as is the tradition. And here we go. So I'm focusing on trying to come up with an estimate of global military carbon emissions, and particularly the military carbon footprint. And as you've seen, military data is poor, so this is a tough ask to do. But there is some data out there, so we have had a go at this. The uncertainties are large, but here's what we tried. So firstly, we had to find a starting point for extrapolating data, which are the data that we could use to extrapolate total emissions from that were available. So we looked at the data officially reported to the UNFCCC, the military emissions data that Lindsay talked about, and you can see that was very variable, non-existent, inconsistent. That seemed a dead end. Then looked at military spending figures and whether some sort of emissions per unit currency could be applied. But again, there were quite some significant gaps in the military spending data that was published, and there was a lot of variability between figures, even within countries, as you get currency exchange rates, inflation, economic growth, all sorts of economic factors affect that. So that we didn't find very productive. We started looking at the numbers of military vehicles and their emissions per vehicle. That looks like it might yield some useful data, but it's very data intensive. It would take a lot of work to do that. We don't have a big enough research team at the moment. So that one's for the future, I think. So the one we focused on was military personnel figures and emissions per head of military personnel. Military personnel figures are widely available for all the big militaries. They are published annually by, for example, the International Institute of Strategic Studies. So, we found some useful data on the emissions per head of personnel. So that was our starting point. If I can switch to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. So we used 4 main data sets. So numbers of active military personnel that I've just talked about. Then we looked at stationary emissions per head of personnel. So that's the emissions per head of active military personnel for military bases, things that don't move. And we looked at both fuel use and electricity use to come up with some figures here. There was some reasonable data for the UK, the US, Germany that we used. It was over a period of time. There was consistency in this data that we could see, and you could see, importantly, you could see when it varied. You could see why it varied. It tended, there was a lot of consistency, but sometimes it varied, for example, because the national grid decarbonised and therefore the emissions per unit for electricity use fell. So you could see, you could track some changes. So that seemed to be a good data set to start using. Once you've got the stationary emissions, then you need to estimate the mobile emissions. And we looked at some data from the US, the UK, Germany, and some extra data from across the EU. And we saw that there was a range of figures for the ratio between stationary and mobile emissions. It's depending on how operationally active the military was. If it had a larger proportion of high emission technologies like planes, warships, those sorts of factors tended to affect that. So we got a range for that ratio. And then we looked at the supply chain, and we got some data from the UK, a UK modelling group in Lancaster University, and their data is very useful. It does a whole economy model of how different spending patterns affect emissions, and so we're able to attach some figures for that. And then we compared them with some international data published by the Carbon Progress Initiative, I think they're called. The full details are in the report. And they had come up with numbers based on surveys from right across the international supply chain in a wide range of different industries, and it gave us at least confidence that we're in the right area with our estimates. That's probably the area that's got the most uncertainty, so there's clearly work to be done there. So what were our results? Well, the first estimate we made was a global estimate for operational emissions, so to use the jargon, scope 1 and 2 emissions, and we estimated that was about 500 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is about 1% of global carbon emissions. There's an uncertainty range there on the screen, and then we also tried to break down the estimate by geopolitical region, so there are some figures in the report on that. Because there's a lot of averaging involved, we didn't go further and produce country level estimates. We think that would be less reliable, and in order to do that, you would need to take more account of country specific circumstances. For the military carbon footprint, we came up with a figure that was about 2,750 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's somewhere in the region of 5.5% of global carbon emissions. And you can see there that's the effect of the supply chain. Again, this is one of the figures with a larger uncertainty, so the uncertainty range reflects that. But this figure that we've estimated, our best estimate at the moment, this is larger than Russia's total carbon footprint, the whole of Russia. So this is very, very large, and in a list of nations, national footprints, you would have at the top China, second USA, third India, fourth would be the global military, and then Russia. So it gives you an idea of just how big this is. And because military spending and military decisions are under the direct control of government, this is an area where government decisions can make a big difference. So that's worth bearing in mind. And a final word about the assumptions we made and the data not included. This data was basically, the data we included was about fuel use, electricity use, supply chain use. And a lot of that was sourced from militaries, and we assume that data to be reliable. So if that data gets refined over time because we find out more, and again, as you see from the previous talks, there's some question marks over that, that would refine our estimates. But we also didn't include things like the emissions from warfighting impacts, the scope 3+ that Doug talked about. And there's some very interesting data from the report published yesterday by researchers, international researchers, and the Ukrainian researchers on the Ukraine war. And that would significantly increase the estimates that we produced here. And the other thing that's not included is radiative forcing by aviation, because aviation, the jet aircraft fly in the stratosphere, they have an additional warming effect, which effectively doubles their carbon emissions. That's not included here, and for militaries which have a large air force, that would be significant too. So the global military carbon footprint could be much larger than the estimate we published here. So if you want to download the report, please do. There's our website. I'll put the specific website in the chat.
Great, thank you very much, Stuart. I really appreciate it. It's my absolute pleasure to bring in some fresh, diverse perspectives from Korea. Inshul and Juniso Wang. Inshul Wang is the manager of Green Korea United and director of the Korean Climate Crisis Emergency Action Network. He's contributed to the climate justice movement and invested globally and investigated military and environment issues in Korea and also globally. Inshul will present on the status of Korean military missions and actions to hold governments accountable. Inshul will be supported by Junisu Wang. He's an activist researcher in environment and recently finished his PhD, woohoo, on environmental crime and peace in Northern Ireland. And he investigates environmental crimes in overseas US military bases, including NATO. So let's have a warm welcome for both Inshul and Junisu, who are need to open up their camera. Stuart, can you close your camera? Okay. Inshul, do you guys want to open up your cameras? Are you?
Looks fine from here, Ben.
Okay, great. Sorry.
Okay, nice to meet you, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. And I'm going to present in Korean, and Junso is going to be my translator. 반갑습니다. 한국의 사례, 한국의 군 배출량 관련된 발표를 하도록 하겠습니다. 밀리터리 리미션계 군사부문 배출 격차 그동안의 데이터에서 보이는 것처럼 한국은 전 세계 12에 군사비를 배출하는 군사 대국인데 제대로 된 군 배출량을 보고하고 있지 않습니다. 지금 보이는 이 데이터에 사용하는 것을 보면 2016년도 보고서를 가지고 거기 실린 데이터 내용 배출량 1A5 배출량이 기록되어 있습니다.
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me. So my presentation is about military emissions in South Korea, and as you can see in the graph, in the figure, South Korea is the 10th largest country in terms of military expenditure. So, which means South Korea is quite huge military spender in the world. But it hasn't reported about its carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions properly. As you can see, the figure on the left, South Korea made a report based on its data in 2016, and it shows the total emissions of greenhouse. The total emissions is about 3,065 MT CO2. Okay.
네, 여기에 나와 있는 거는 이제 국가 온실가스 인벤토리 보고서 2016년도 데이터인데 지금 보시는 거는 그 이후 17년, 18년, 19년의 데이터들을 보실 수가 있습니다. 일정 정도 증가하다가 다시 약간 줄어드는 것을 볼 수 있는데요. 이 데이터들의 문제는 간접 배출량이 포함되어 있지 않다는 것, 스코프 2가 제외되어 있다는 것, 그리고 단순히 석유류 사용량만 계산하고 있다는 것, 그리고 고정량, 이동량 등이 구분되어 있지 않다라는 것이 이 보고서에서도 그대로 인정을 하고 있고, 그래서 정확한 배출 통계가 아니라고 할 수 있습니다.
So this data shows carbon emissions after 2016. So from 2007, between 2017 and 2019, there was a bit of increase and then a slight decrease in 2019. But the limitation, one of the limitations of this national inventory report is that it excluded scope 2 emissions, and it only included petroleum usage and stationary sources and mobile sources were not disaggregated in the inventory report, which means, as the report also admitted, it does not show precise data on emissions in the military sector.
그래서 한국의 시민사회는 정확한 군 배출량을 알기 위해서 2020년도 세계 군축 행동의 날을 맞아서 시민사회가 공동으로 국방부에 질의를 한 적이 있습니다. 당신들이 온실가스 배출 통계를 작성하고 있냐라고 했을 때 그들은 그런 통계는 만들고 있지 않다, 측정하고 있지 않다라는 답변을 받았습니다.
So in 2020, on the Global Days of Action on Military Spending, the Green Korea United and also other civil social organizations sent an official question to the Korea Ministry of Defense, asking whether the Ministry of Defense is calculating carbon emissions in the military sector, and the answer was no. The ministry said the government doesn't count carbon emissions in the military sector. And it only has some plans for green energy projects.
그 뒤에 한국의 정보 공개 청구 법에 따라서 국방부가 군 온실가스 배출량 산정에 관한 연구를 하고 있다라는 정보를 파악을 했고 그래서 정보공개 청구를 국방부에 실시했습니다. 하지만 국방부는 국가안전보장, 국방 등에 관한 사항이라는 이유로 연구 보고서 자체를 내용을 비공개했고 단지 이제 2020년 군 배출량, 그 연구 보고서에 포함된 2020년 군 배출량 수치만을 공개를 했습니다. 그 수치가 대략 388만 톤에 해당을 했고, 이조차도 정확한 조사에 기반한 것이 아니라 단지 표본 조사에 기반해서 산출했다고 답변을 했습니다.
So this year, South Korea has the law of freedom of information, and so this year we requested the Ministry of Defense to disclose its research project on the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions in the military sector. So the ministry admitted that they commissioned a research team to conduct a research project on to calculate greenhouse emissions in the Korean military sector, but the ministry rejected to disclose the core contents of the report. That was because, as the ministry said, that was because of national security and defense-related matters. But what we could find based on our request for information disclosure was that in 2020, the Korean military, the carbon emissions from the Korean military was approximately 3.8 million tons. But even this figure appears to be not precise because, as the ministry admitted, the calculation was not made based on the whole investigation of the military sector, but rather it was estimated based on a sampling method.
이 배출량이 어느 정도 양이냐라고 할 때 한국에서는 공공부문의 전체 각 기관별 온실가스 배출량을 측정하고 있는데, 그것이 2020년 기준으로 3,700만 톤에 해당을 합니다. 그런데 한국군만 배출한 그 양이 이 공공부문 전체 온실가스 배출량보다 많다는 것은 그 양이 상당하다라는 것이고, 아울러 공공부문 이 관리 정책 안에서 한국군이 누락되어 있는 것을 말해주고 있습니다. 준.
Yes. So this slide shows how much does the Korean military emit as compared to the whole Korean public sector. The whole Korean public sector in 2020 emitted around 37 million tons of carbons in 1 year. But the Korean military emitted more than that, as the figure appears to be around 38 million tons of carbons. So this means this has two meanings. One is that the Korean military itself emits carbons much more than the carbon emissions that the whole Korean public sector has generated. And also, secondly, it shows that the Korean military data, carbon emissions data from the Korean military are not included in the Korean public sector.
한국은 공공부문 온실가스 에너지 목표 관리제라는 제도를 통해서 공공부문의 온실가스를 측정하고 감축하기 위한 제도를 시행하고 있고, 여기에 783개 기관이 포함되어 있습니다. 하지만 이 운영 지침에 국가안보나 국방과 직결되는 시설, 곧 군대는 제외할 수 있다라고 정함으로써 이 군대의 그 배출량 자체를 측정하지 않고 통계와 관리의 사각지대로 만들고 있습니다. 준.
Yes. Sorry, I'm just this time. So the South Korean government has so-called greenhouse gas energy target management system in the public sector. This mechanism is to make public institutions set their greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, and also the government monitors them, the outcomes of the targets annually. So far to date, 783 public institutions, governmental organizations should be held accountable for the system. However, according to the guideline of the system, in Article 9, it says military security and defense-related facilities and institutions can be excluded from the system. This shows the government is actually creating a loophole in monitoring carbon emissions in the public sector, especially related to military and defense sector.
이런 새로 밝혀진 내용들을 언론에 보도가 되고 알려졌지만 사실 국방부나 정부는 이에 대해서 아무런 대답도 또 어떠한 반응도 내놓지 않았습니다.
So we have found new information that we acquired under the Freedom of Information Act and etc. But the Korean Ministry of Defense and also the national government have not responded to any of these updates of information.
그 뒤에 국회의원실을 통해서 재차 관련된 보고서의 공개를 요구했지만 국방부는 국회에도 관련된 보고서를 공개를 하지 않았고, 다만 이번에 그들이 작성한 보고서의 그 배출 범위가 스코프 1과 2에 해당한다는 것까지는 답변을 주었습니다. 준.
So we try to get the report, the national inventory report that the Ministry of Defense is commissioning through a parliamentarian's office. But the Ministry of Defense once again rejected to disclose the report, but it admitted that their calculation of carbon emissions in the military sector will include scope 1 and 2 in this time.
요약을 하면 이제 국가 온실가스 인벤토리 보고서에서 작성된 내용과 국방부 보고서의 내용은 그 양에 있어서도 이번에 측정한 새로 밝혀진 배출량이 더 많다라는 것, 그리고 스코프가 어디까지 해당하는지가 서로 다르다라는 것, 그리고 여전히 세부 내용에 있어서는 굉장히 많은 한계가 있다라는 것을 확인할 수 있었습니다. 준.
So in summary, we compared emissions report, two emissions reports, and the national inventory report and the emissions report that is being commissioned by the Korean Ministry of Defense shows some differences, especially in terms of the amount of carbon emissions. The Korean military's emission report shows much larger amount of carbon emissions. This may be derived from a different method that is used to calculate carbon emissions, given that the Korean military emission report includes scope 1 and 2. But in a detailed look shows both reports have some limitations, given that detailed information isn't provided.
중요한 건 앞서 발표에 있는 것처럼 스코프 1, 2만이 중요한 게 아니라 스코프 3와 3 플러스도 여전히 중요한 부분이지만 한국의 경우 최근 들어 굉장히 세계에서 가장 높은 방위산업 무기 수출 증가율을 보여주고 있기 때문에 이러한 것은 곧 한국의 스코프 3가 상당한 양이 될 것이라는 것을 예측할 수 있습니다.
So not only scope 1 and 2, but also scope 3 emissions that may fall into scope 3 and 3 plus should be considered as important pollutants, important emitters, factors of greenhouse gas emissions. South Korea has become one of the leading countries in arms exports and the defense industry. Probably South Korea has shown probably the largest increase in terms of arms exports in the world. This suggests that South Korea carbon emissions by South Korea, which may fall into scope 3, will be quite significant in terms of the size.
또한 한반도에선 지금도 계속 분단으로 인해 군사적 긴장이 계속되기 때문에 정부나 또 많은 시민들이 국가 안보의 논리에 따라서 군대의 어떤 정보를 투명하게 공개하거나 정부가 군사 부분의 어떤 배출에 대해 적극적인 행동을 하는 거에 대해서 상당히 부정적인 반응을 보임으로써 이러한 한국 정부가 책임 있게 행동하게 하는 데 있어서 굉장히 큰 어려움으로 작용하고 있는 것이 현실입니다.
In reality, the Korean Peninsula has been divided for more than 7 decades now, and the military tension is still going on between two Koreas. This socio-political condition helps South Korea, the Korean government, to utilize the logic of national security to prevent itself from being transparent, and also the public opinion. There is a bit of a public opinion which is quite negative on the role of the military on taking more proactive actions towards carbon emissions, carbon reduction. So this is one of the limitations that environment campaigns may face in South Korea.
네, 예정된 시간을 초과해서 죄송합니다. 이상으로 저희 발표를 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Inchul and June for your really, really fascinating contribution. It's great to move the perspective sort of away from UK-based research and really see what it looks like to use this research and data in combination with advocacy. So I'm Ellie, I'm campaigner at the Conflict and Environment Observatory, and we're now going to open up the floor to questions to our panelists. So if you'd like to ask a question, please pop it in the Q&A function. So we have had a few already. Let me find that. So I think one of the interesting sort of conversations one of the interesting questions towards the beginning, which links into what you were just saying, came from Nick Buxton from TNI, which I just had and now it's disappeared, but it's based around the reasoning for NATO deciding not to publish its methodology. Here we go, sorry. I understand that NATO says it won't release its methodology for operational security reasons. Is there a basis for that argument, or is it just a fudge to avoid transparency and security? So I wondered if one of our panelists wanted to pick up on that.
I don't mind taking the first stab at answering that. Well, from my position, I would say that is a fudge, because it's no different from an organization. They talk about commercial sensitivity and there's ways to get around that. A methodology is a methodology. You're not necessarily disclosing sensitive data. So if they've not disclosed, this methodology was announced that it would be developed last year. We were in anticipation that it would be shared so we could all see exactly what everyone would be measuring against. But we don't have that, so we don't know how it's being done. So this is what we're calling for. We're calling for the NATO methodology to be made public, so we can all understand how the emissions are being calculated. I think it's really important that we have that transparency. NATO are setting up their Centre of Excellence. I think it's beginning of next year or very soon in Canada. And a lot of talk around that is about transparency. Well, this doesn't reflect that in my mind.
And happy just to jump in as well, just some additional thoughts. Yeah, maybe on the political context. So it's quite strange watching NATO make these statements and announcements that it's going to be work towards net zero and this, and they make these statements, and there's kind of an assumption from the public that that's NATO as a whole, but actually it's just NATO institutionally, which is some offices and some very limited forces. And actually it doesn't apply to all NATO's members. And it's almost NATO's members that are the problem in some respects, because there is no consistent policy around military emissions reporting or accounting across NATO's members. There are some who are relatively good at it and relatively further advanced, like the US, the UK, but then there are many others who aren't. Poland, for example. And so NATO almost has to have this consensus position. And at the moment, there is no consensus around the release of this methodology, as far as we understand it. But again, it's making a mockery of the positions which NATO is trumpeting around being a leader on climate security and having this net zero goal. Yeah, unless it really sort of takes these more difficult decisions, it's going to really struggle with credibility. And I think that comes back to that point I made around this military grade greenwashing, essentially, and the need to develop trust and just the need for transparency. As Lindsay says, this is basic stuff which organizations do. It's not necessarily sensitive military information.
I suppose just to end that as well by saying that shameless plug that our call to NATO for credible climate action is still running on our website, and we are still looking for organisations to join that. So yeah, please head to our website to find out more about that. So I know that we've got quite a few academics and researchers on this call. So I think a really good question that's come in is targeted towards Stuart around what do you think the next step should be for research?
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, my video has stopped working for some reason that I cannot figure out. So you'll just have to make do with a blank screen, I'm afraid. On research, yes, the key areas for the methodology that I've talked about here. Oh, thank you, it's working now. For the methodology that I talked about here, next steps are to expand it, to refine it so that you can do country level estimates. I think some more steps are needed to be able to do that, to go from the global to the regional, and then the next step is a country level estimate that's credible. And we need a bit more data to be incorporated to do that. Another issue is particularly to try and look at how we might include the warfighting impacts, or the impacts that have been talked about in the study yesterday from Ukraine. Is a great place to start. So I will be looking at that, and colleagues will be looking at that, how you can use that to come up with an estimate of the global carbon footprint, as I call it, which would be even higher than the 5.5%. And there's also keeping up that, I mean, there's a whole job in itself to keep up with the data, new data as it's published, and update the estimates that we've already produced. So that's on that basic level. And then there's plenty of research to go on about looking particularly, for me, the most important area beyond that is looking at how changes in security, the security situation, changes in government policies around militaries, which leads to them shrinking, helps reduce emissions. And I think that's, from the small amount of historical data we got, we see that there are big falls in military emissions when there are periods where international security improves and militaries cut their spending. And the technological solutions that people like to focus on are much harder to determine whether they are effective. There are certain things like, if a country decarbonizes its national grid, then the military as an electricity user, its emissions will go down. That's fairly straightforward. But beyond that, there's not much evidence of militaries reducing their emissions purely on a technological basis. It seems, you know, as they get an improvement, a more efficient piece of kit, they simply use it more. They extend its range, or it carries more weapons, for example. So we need more research on the ways in which we can really reduce emissions, the ones that are effective. I know improving the security situation is not a straightforward thing, but is the one that has a proven track record.
Thank you so much for that, Stuart. So we are at time, but I think we're going to keep it running just for a little bit longer because we have too many interesting people in one Zoom webinar to end this. So we'll probably keep it running for another 5 minutes or so. So please do keep your questions coming. So another one we've had in is based around the UK's net zero target. So do you know if the UK's 2050 net zero target includes emissions from military sources? Is there any way that emissions from such sources might be able to be excluded under current legislation?
Yeah, and in the UK, there are, in the national communication, there are some military categories. So there's military aviation, military shipping figures. And so they are part of the UK's emissions that are controlled under the net zero target. There are some other emissions from military bases, which seem, as far as we can tell, they're not explicitly identified in the statistics, but they do seem to be included within civilian categories which are controlled. And then there are upstream emissions as well, also upstream emissions, supply chain emissions. The arms industry within the country is controlled. The problem comes when the military says, well, this is starting to constrict our freedom of activity, therefore we want exemptions. And they're already, if you look at internal targets within the MOD, there are no internal targets for greenhouse gas emissions on its military operations. There are targets for its military bases, but not for its operation, not for its equipment use. And that's the problem that we will come to. As civilian emissions fall, the greater the proportion of military emissions will become, unless we have some sort of change that reduces military emissions, and they're going to bump up against each other. And at those times, under current legislation, and I think in other countries it's even worse, the military will simply ask for an exemption and they will get it.
Thank you for that. So I think what is probably going to be our final question, because it's quite mighty. So where are we and what are the prospects of having military emissions addressed at the UNFCCC level? Anyone can, don't all shout at once. It might be interesting to hear from a couple of people on this one, actually. So,
well, I'll make a start because I am an optimist. Last year we had some side events on the fringes. This year, unfortunately, probably because of the situation, driven by the situation in Ukraine, there was a side event in the blue zone at COP27. So there's much more coverage with all aspects with respect to the environmental impacts of conflict. Unfortunately, it's getting a lot more media attention and it's getting much more focus. So I'm hoping that will unfortunately drive the attention further up the scale, but it's not on the official agenda for this COP. We think we still need to do a lot of work to get it up the agenda for the next COP. And we are still not seeing, okay, it's just 2 years on that we've been looking at the data. We're seeing no improvements at all. And even if it was good, the data that was provided to the UN, it's not good enough because it's only based on a small factor. We don't know, again, all the other emission related to the military and related to military fighting activities. So I am an optimist because I know it's moved on a long way since last year, but we have a hell of a long way still to go.
Maybe just pitch in. Yeah, I think I agree with Lindsay. It's a long way to go, but I'm actually quite excited by how dynamic this space is. And just over, obviously, folk have been working on this for far more than the last 12 months, as Ben said at the start. But I think over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, the nature of the conversation has changed dramatically, the number of people engaging in it. It was really exciting to have Inchul and June on today talking about their experience, what they've been doing in South Korea. There are other organizations, I recognize Australian friends in the chat earlier who've been looking into Australian reporting. And I think there's real potential for, historically, a lot of this focus has been around the US and the Pentagon's emissions because they are so large and there's been less attention on militaries globally. This is a global problem. The UNFCCC getting it on the platform there would be a global solution. yeah, I think there's so much potential for networking and building coalition building with colleagues in other countries who are all working across this issue. And that's actually going to be fundamental to progressing this, the UNFCCC level and promoting it further. And yeah, it was great to hear the session in the Ukrainian pavilion yesterday, and I recognise Leonard there in the chat, who'd worked on the report. So yeah, it's an incredible foothold, I guess, to have there. So yeah, let's keep building on it and keep the momentum going.
Does anybody else want to come in on that? Ben, oh.
I guess the only thing to add is just this problem is at the moment is getting bigger and bigger. Military spending is going up and shows no prospect of slowing down at the moment, and so this problem is going to get bigger and bigger, and therefore, so it's great that it's getting more attention, but it's getting more attention because it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And I'm not optimistic about the way in which things are growing in Ukraine. There is a long war that's still being fought there, and there are long wars still being fought in other parts of the world that we shouldn't forget about either. And we are not focusing enough on how to find better ways of resolving conflict. And that's the factor that's kind of behind all of this. Is that's the thing that's going to be most effective. We need cooperation to tackle the climate crisis already. And cooperation is fracturing because of the fracturing of the international situation over this conflict in particular, and we need to rebuild that, and that's not easy to do. But the 1.5 degree target is on its way out the window at the moment, so we absolutely have to, and we have to get this message across more widely that yeah, for all our sakes, we need to get together and work on this stuff and get these emissions down, both military emissions and right across the board. It needs to be done fast.
I think that is a good place to wrap up. So I'd really like to thank all of our panelists for being involved, and obviously all of our attendees as well for coming along and listening. It's been such an insightful session, and I think a really valuable contribution to the wider conversation around COP27 at the moment. I think hearing from Inchol and June from Green Korea really demonstrated quite how valuable this data and research is for moving the issue of military emissions gap into action. Transparent reporting is the first step towards much needed emissions reductions, and as we've heard, we can't ignore the source of 5.5% of global emissions. We really welcome any organisation internationally who want to work on this issue in their country, and we're completely here to support you with that, so please do get in touch. We've recently written a policy brief which we'll be taking into COP27 next week, but this is also available online on our website at CEOBS.org as a foundation for any organisation who want to take this issue forward in their country. So we will be back next year updating militaryemissions.org with the latest data from countries ahead of COP28. But I hope to see and hear from many of you before then. So thank you all and have a lovely day.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ellie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.